We should think about all things intersectionally, but colorism is my particular area of focus. So let's begin by acknowledging the fact that even when we see affirming representations of dark skinned people, and as someone who is in this conversation every day and who is myself an advocate for colorism, I see this so often that even when we bring dark skinned people to the table or when we are trying to promote positive and affirming representations of those people, they are very often traditionally or conventionally acceptable, quote unquote, or respectable in many other ways, right? So a lot of times the dark skinned people who are most celebrated, most affirmed, even in spaces when we talk about colorism, are cisgendered women or dark skinned Black men. A lot of times they are thin, able bodied, or they have an athletic build or frame. And then even thinking about Futurism, so a lot of times they have thin noses or chiseled features, and a lot of times they are wearing their hair straight or they have naturally looser curl textures, right? And so part of my mission is to not just increase representation for dark-skinned people, but to diversify the representation of diverse people, diverse dark-skinned people, right? And I like saying that, diverse dark-skinned people, because there is so much diversity even amongst us as dark-skinned people that is still not adequately represented and definitely not adequately celebrated. First, I want to acknowledge that intersectionality was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in 1989. But for me, there's a few specific intersections that people most often or that we see having a larger frequent impact on colorism, right? And so different things can impact or influence how we navigate the world in our skin tone. But some things tend to have a greater impact. And my theory is that the things that are most visible, right, the aspects of our identity that are most visible sometimes do have a more immediate impact or a more immediate influence. So in the past live stream, I talked about educational levels, right? And so yes, having a doctorate degree gives me a benefit or gives me access to things and opportunities that dark-skinned women who don't have higher education might not get. However, that is something that if I'm walking through a grocery store or if I'm being pulled over by the cops or if I am trying on clothes, right? Or just minding my own business, walking down the sidewalk in New York City, right? No one's going to see my level of education, right? And so we have to be mindful of things that in certain contexts, one of your identities might have a larger impact than they do in other contexts, right? Okay, so a few of the main intersections that we most often talk about, and I think people report based on people's testimonies, based on a lot of the research, are number one, gender and gender identity. But I want to start off with gender because I think it's so prevalent, and I think because sexism and misogyny and misogynoir are so prevalent in our society and so much of the culture is based in patriarchy, I think gender is one that really makes a big impact. And so colorism impacts people of all genders, right? Regardless of our gender identity, we likely are being impacted by colorism, right? But because we live in patriarchal societies, many of us, most of us, it is disproportionately impacting women and femmes, right? Because we are most harshly judged based on our physical appearances, because privilege can compound, but so can marginalization and oppression, right? It compounds, it is exacerbated. And a big part of that is because traditionally speaking, darker skin has been associated with masculinity, right? That narrative has been propagated and spread throughout most cultures. And the notion that femininity or that feminine people or more feminine bodies should inherently be lighter or whiter, right? Or have longer hair or straighter hair. Which brings me to another intersection, which are features and hair textures. So I've said in the past that over a decade ago, when I first started talking about colorism, people weren't using Futurism and Texturism as separate terms. And so I was including them in the umbrella of colorism. But now that we have more nuanced vocabulary, I am, making those their distinct things. And so even amongst dark-skinned people, if you have thinner features or if you have a straighter hair texture, then you have a form of privilege. You have some advantage over darker skinned people who also have afro textured hair or who also have wide noses or full lips, right? And Futurism, anytime you hear those isms, right, it is a hierarchy. And so people have stigmatized wider noses and really thick lips, right? And I know people are saying, oh, but you know, you have white people getting injections to make their lips fuller, right? But there's a difference even in the artificially plumped up lips of a white woman, for example, and the naturally full, the naturally thick lips of that many Black people have. And so it's, again, these hierarchies are not just personal preferences or just superficial beauty standards. There are stigmas and there's concrete, tangible discrimination and sometimes violence perpetuated against these people because their features and their body types and their various types of identities are stigmatized and marginalized and scapegoated, right, in order to project or advance the agenda of oppressive regimes. And then when we talk about texturism and hair, that intersection, I've in the past talked about different definitions for texturism and hairism. And I think this is very helpful. I don't think it has caught on necessarily, but I hope it does catch on at some point. But I think we should distinguish between texturism and hairism. And so the definitions I propose are: one, texturism is the hierarchy of based on the actual curl pattern, right? Based on the density and the degree of curliness or coiliness that you have to your hair, right? So the actual texture of your natural hair, the way it grows from your scalp, right? That's texturism. And I think it's also useful to have hairism as a different related category that includes texturism, but I think hairism can also include not just the texture of the hair, but also the style of the hair, right? The hairstyle. And so we see people being discriminated and marginalized and ostracized because of their hair texture, but we also see that happening because of the hairstyles. And so traditionally Black hairstyles that come from, that are born from Black culture, like cornrows, like locks, like Bantu knots, like afros, like Afro puffs, right? These types of hairstyles, regardless of the texture, are also stigmatized. So even if you have, let's say, 2A hair as a Black person, your hair is not Afro textured, but you wear it in braids or you wear it in Bantu knots, right? You still might face some level of discrimination because the cultural identity that that hairstyle represents is a stigmatized culture, right? Black culture. And so even if you have 4C hair or type 4 hair, for example, a hair texture like mine, if I were to straighten it, it would be less stigmatized, right? It's the same texture. My hair is the same texture even if I straighten it, but people will see it as more acceptable. It will be seen as more valued or valid in society if I straighten it, right? But because I choose the style of an afro, I will experience more discrimination than if I took my same hair texture and wore it straight, okay? So I think that's an important distinction in terms of the intersections of colorism. And a lot of the dark-skinned people I talk about say that for them, it was like, it's the combination of being darker skinned and having a certain hair texture, right? Or it's the combination of being darker skinned and being in a larger body, right? Which is the fifth, what intersection are we on? 1, 2, 3, the fourth intersection that I want to talk about, which is body type. And so those with larger bodies and those with other stigmatized body types, their experiences of colorism are exacerbated because of that, right? And again, as I mentioned, when we think about the quote unquote dark skinned beauties that people try to promote in order to address colorism and say, oh, well, look at, you know, all these beautiful dark skinned women. And most of them that are celebrated and put forth as positive representations for dark skinned people, most of them are thin women, are, you know, muscular or athletic looking people, or have an athletic build or a thin build. And so I always use that as an example for me when I'm role modeling how to acknowledge privilege, because I'm not just going to ask other people to check their privilege or to acknowledge it. I also have to be very clear and very open and honest about the ways that I am privileged as well. And so having been a dark-skinned person, but always having been tall and thin, I know that I'm not as stigmatized. I have not faced the degree or the levels of bullying, of marginalization, of discrimination that someone who has my skin tone and my hair texture, but also has a larger body, or also has a different body type that's not valued in society, right? And body type also goes into things like disability, right, or physical ability as well. And then another really significant intersection that impacts people's experience of colorism is socioeconomic class. So I read an article about this early on in my studies, so many years ago, that helped me to start to see the intersections of colorism and why you'll have some dark-skinned people say, well, I never experienced that. And you'll have other dark-skinned people say, well, I experience that every day, right? And so if you are middle class, or if you are wealthy, if you have parents who have college degrees and have worked in corporate jobs and have money, and they gave you a car, a brand new Lexus or BMW at 16, or, a lot of your colorism experiences are mitigated. Your money, your class can sometimes be a hedge around you for experiencing colorism. Now, an alternative perspective that I've had from dark-skinned people who are sort of upper middle class or grew up in wealthy families is that they felt more exposed to colorism precisely because they were in elite circles. They were in the circles of other bourgeoisie Black people. And so they felt even more exposed because of that. But what the research would suggest is that you have more options to compensate or to mitigate for the discrimination that you might experience if you have more money. The last one I think is super important, and that is race. So colorism is an intersection of race. Colorism impacts racism, but racism also impacts colorism, right? It's a mutually influencing systems here. And so when I talk about race and colorism, or race as an intersection of colorism, we have to remember that anti-Blackness and the disdain for Black people around the globe plays a huge role in colorism around the world. And so we have to always be talking about that in the framework of colorism, especially in a multicultural context, in a multi-ethnic context, in a global context, is that even lighter skinned or browner skinned Black people will experience forms of discrimination and types of discrimination that people of other races who are not Black will not face, right? And so even if two people have a similar skin tone, if their ethnic identity or their racial identity is different, then perceptions of them are also going to be different, right? And so you might have a dark-skinned Southeast Asian person, for example, at least in the United States, right, where they're still perceived as, smart or intelligent, whereas a Black person of the same skin tone is less likely to be seen that way, right? And so we also have to look at the intersection of race. A couple of examples that I see happening often in marketing and casting and in leadership and senior management. And so when we look at marketing and casting, you all know, because I've talked about this so many times, but it bears repeating. I don't mind repeating myself until everyone on the planet is aware and knows these things. I'm happy to keep saying the same thing because I want everyone to know and be reminded of these things. So some of these intersections show up a lot in commercials and advertisements and magazines and in casting, right? So the entertainment industry is a business, right? It is also corporate. And so when we are casting people, even if it's like hiring people to do rendering or graphics for a company, we have to go back to the intersection of gender, where when you do see representations of dark-skinned people, a lot of times they are men or masculine, right? And if they are paired with or partnered with someone who is supposed to be a woman or supposed to be more feminine, a lot of times that person will be lighter than the man or the masculine individual, right? And then also, again, the dark-skinned women who are represented in these roles, if they are represented, they are more likely to be cisgendered and thin, right? And so even when we are representing dark-skinned people, we are very traditional about it in other ways. So either it's the dark-skin representation is a man or a masculine figure, or it's a very thin noses, thin body, right? Or straighter hair textures for if they are a woman or a feminine individual. But another one is thinking about leadership and senior management. So again, you have it's more acceptable for a dark-skinned man to be assertive, right? Whereas if a dark-skinned woman is setting up boundaries and being assertive, she's hard to work with, or she's difficult to work with. And then not to mention perceptions of intelligence, or perceptions of being who's professional and who's not. All these things are being influenced by colorism, and people with lighter skin tones fare better in terms of these implicit biases. And another thing we see sometimes is that when there are darker skinned people represented, a lot of times they aren't Black, right? And so you might have management or a board of people where there's a lot of diversity, even in skin tones. Even if you have ethnic and racial and skin tone diversity, you might still not have any Black people in leadership, or you might not have any Black people on that board, right? So those are some ways that we have to be able to recognize these things and see them even in our workplaces.